20 Marines stood up at once. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor of the wedding hall. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The string quartet faltered and went quiet. Then a voice rang out across the room. "General on deck." 20 hands snapped to salute. And suddenly, every single one of the 120 guests at my brother's wedding was staring directly at me. My mother's face drained of color. My brother Daniel looked like someone had punched the air out of his lungs. And my father dropped his wine glass. Red wine splashed across the white tablecloth like spilled blood. All of it happened in less than 10 seconds. 10 seconds that changed how my family saw me forever. But the truth is, that moment started with a phone call 3 weeks earlier. Part 1, the phone call. 3 weeks before Daniel's wedding, I was sitting on the porch of my small house in Jacksonville, North Carolina, about 15 minutes outside Camp Lejeune. It was late September, the kind of Carolina evening where the air still holds summer heat, but the breeze hints that fall is coming. I had a glass of iced tea on the table beside me and a yellow legal pad full of retirement paperwork. After 32 years in the United States Marine Corps, I was preparing to step away. I had led Marines through desert storms and places most Americans would never want to see. But paperwork might have been the hardest mission of all. That's when my phone rang. I looked down and saw the caller ID. Mom. Now, when you're my age and when your mother is pushing 80, you answer the phone every time. You just do. "Hey, Mom," I said. Her voice came through a little shaky the way it always does when she's trying to sound cheerful. "Margaret, honey, how are you?" She always calls me Margaret. The Marines call me General Carter. But to my mother, I'll always be Margaret. "I'm good," I told her, just drowning in retirement paperwork. "Well, you always liked paperwork," she said. That made me laugh. "No, Mom, I liked getting things done." She chuckled softly. For a few minutes we talked about the usual things: her arthritis, the neighbor's dog that kept digging up her garden, the church bake sale coming up in October. Normal life. The kind of life I missed more often than I care to admit. Then her voice changed. It got quiet. "Margaret," she said slowly, "I wanted to talk to you about Daniel's wedding." My younger brother Daniel. The golden boy of the family. The one who stayed in Ohio. The one who ran Dad's hardware store. The one who never left home? "Sure," I said. "I already booked my flight." "Oh, good," she replied. "We're all so excited for you to come." There was a pause. A long one. 32 years in the Marines teaches you to recognize hesitation. Something was coming. I leaned back in my chair. "What is it, Mom?" "Well," she began. Another pause. Then she said it. "Honey, Daniel was wondering if maybe you might not wear your uniform." For a second, I thought I had misheard her. "My uniform?" "Yes." The porch went quiet except for the sound of cicadas. "Why?" I asked. "Well," she said again, stretching the word thin. "It's just that Daniel and Emily are planning a very elegant wedding. Vineyard venue, lots of Emily's friends from the city." I waited. Then she said the words I still remember perfectly. They just thought, soldiers might make people uncomfortable. Soldiers. The word hung in the air like smoke. I took a slow sip of my tea. "Mom," I said carefully, "I'm not bringing a platoon." She tried to laugh. But it sounded nervous. "Well, of course not, honey, but the uniform is very noticeable." There it was. Noticeable. "Daniel thinks maybe a regular dress would be more appropriate," she added quickly. I stared out across the pine trees beyond my yard. A regular dress. 32 years of service. Combat deployments. Buried friends. Commanding hundreds of Marines. 2 stars on my shoulders. And my brother thought it might be embarrassing. "Did Daniel say that?" I asked quietly. Mom hesitated. "You know how people talk these days. Some folks think military stuff is, well..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I finished it for her. "Embarrassing." Silence filled the line. Finally, she sighed. "He just doesn't want anything to distract from the bride." I leaned forward and rested my elbows on my knees. "Mom," I said gently, "when Daniel graduated high school, who paid for the party?" "You did," she admitted. "When Dad had his heart surgery, who covered the hospital bill?" "You did." "And when Daniel's store almost closed during the recession?" Another quiet moment. You helped him, she said softly. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. I didn't do those things in a dress. More silence. Then my mother said something that surprised me. Margaret, sometimes people just don't understand your life. Her voice wasn't accusing. It was tired. Old. And maybe a little ashamed. I looked down at the legal pad on the table. My retirement paperwork. The end of a life most people never truly understand. Mom, I said after a moment, I wouldn't miss Daniel's wedding. I know that, honey. And I'll be respectful. I know. But the uniform is part of who I am. She didn't answer right away. Then she said something quiet. I was afraid you might say that. We talked for a few more minutes after that, but the warmth had faded from the conversation. Before hanging up, she said softly, We love you, Margaret. I love you too, Mom. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time. The cicadas kept singing. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, and I thought about my family. About how after 32 years, they still didn't really know me. Then I stood up and walked inside. My dress uniform hung in a garment bag in the hallway closet. I unzipped the bag slowly. The Marine Corps dress blues gleamed under the light. Dark blue coat, red piping, rows of ribbons, medals polished bright, and on the shoulders, 2 silver stars. Brigadier General. I ran my hand gently across the fabric. Then I smiled. Well, I said quietly to the empty house. Looks like you're going to a wedding. I wasn't always General Carter. For most of my life, I was just Maggie, the strange Carter girl who didn't quite fit anywhere. I grew up in a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, back in the early 70s. Back then, the town was mostly factories, cornfields, and people who believed life followed a pretty simple script. Boys grew up to work with their hands. Girls grew up to marry those boys. My mother taught Sunday school. My father owned a small hardware store on Main Street. And my younger brother Daniel was the pride of the family from the moment he could throw a baseball straight. Me. I climbed trees. I fixed lawnmowers. And by the time I was 12, I could change the oil in my father's pickup truck faster than most of the men who came into his shop. Dad didn't quite know what to make of me. One afternoon when I was about 14, he found me in the garage taking apart a carburetor. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You know, he said, most girls your age are learning to cook. I wiped grease off my hands with a rag. Well, I told him most girls probably don't have a carburetor that needs fixing. He shook his head, but I caught the corner of a smile. Still, things were different back then. Girls weren't expected to lead. They weren't expected to command. And they definitely weren't expected to join the United States Marine Corps. The first time I told my family I was thinking about the military, I was 17 years old. We were sitting around the dinner table. Me, Mom, Dad, and Daniel. I remember the exact meal. Meatloaf. Mashed potatoes. Green beans. Normal Midwestern dinner. I talked to a Marine recruiter today, I said. The room went quiet. Daniel laughed first. You, he said, a Marine. Dad put his fork down slowly. Why would you want to do that? He asked. Because I want to serve, I answered. Mom looked worried. Honey, she said, girls don't need to do something like that. I do. Dad leaned back in his chair. The Marines are for men, he said. That sentence sat heavy in the room. But something inside me had already made its decision. 2 years later, I left for Marine Corps Officer Candidate School. Mom cried at the airport. Daniel joked that I'd be back in a week. Dad shook my hand like I was leaving for a job interview. But none of them said they were proud. Not then. Officer Candidate School in Quantico, Virginia was the hardest thing I had ever done. And I mean that literally. The physical training alone broke half the candidates who showed up. Long runs through Virginia mud. Obstacle courses. Leadership drills where every mistake was magnified. And for a young woman in the late 80s, there was an extra layer. Some people thought I didn't belong there. Some said it out loud. I remember one instructor looking at our platoon on the first day. He stopped in front of me. You better be twice as good as everyone else here, he said. Because half of them already think you shouldn't be. He wasn't trying to discourage me. He was telling the truth. So I worked twice as hard. Then 3 times as hard. I ran until my lungs burned. Studied until midnight. Led every exercise like my career depended on it. Because it did. The day I graduated as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps, I called home. Mom answered. "Oh, Margaret," she said, "that's nice." Nice. That was the word. Dad got on the phone next. "Good job," he said. Short. Polite. But distant. Daniel barely said anything at all. "You still doing that military thing?" he asked. "Yes," I told him. "Okay then," he replied. Life went on. While Daniel stayed in Ohio and eventually took over the hardware store, I moved from base to base. California. Okinawa. North Carolina. I deployed overseas. I learned how to lead Marines through situations where mistakes could cost lives. And over the years, something remarkable happened. The Marines trusted me. Not because I was perfect, but because I never asked them to do something I wouldn't do myself. Promotion followed promotion. Captain. Major. Lieutenant Colonel. Colonel. Each time I called home with the news, the reaction was always about the same. "That's nice, Margaret." The truth is, my family never really understood the world I lived in. To them, the Marines were something you saw on television during the 4th of July. To me, they were family. The kind of family you earn through sweat, trust, and sometimes loss. Years later, when I pinned on my first star, something happened that still sticks with me. I invited my parents to the ceremony. Mom said she was busy with church obligations. Dad said the store couldn't close. Daniel said it sounded too formal. So the only people standing with me when the general pinned that star on my shoulder were Marines. Good men and women who had served beside me for years. Afterward, one of my sergeants came up and said something simple. "Ma'am, your family would be proud if they understood what you've done." I nodded. But deep down I knew something he didn't. Some people never understand things outside their world. And maybe that was okay. I built a life anyway. Deployment after deployment. Command after command. Eventually, 30 years passed. And one day I stood in a room full of officers, while the commandant himself pinned 2 stars on my shoulders. Brigadier General. The first woman from my small Ohio town to ever reach that rank. That night I called my mother. She congratulated me politely. Then she asked if I was eating enough vegetables. And that was that. No parade. No celebration. Just another quiet moment between 2 worlds. Looking back now, I realize something important. My family never meant to dismiss my life. They simply couldn't imagine it. To them, I would always be the girl in the garage with grease on her hands. The girl who didn't quite belong. And maybe that's why the phone call about Daniel's wedding hurt more than I expected. Because after 32 years, they still didn't see me. But the Marines did. And as I would soon learn, so would 120 wedding guests in Virginia. The morning of Daniel's wedding began quietly. Too quietly, if I'm being honest. I woke up in a small hotel room in Charlottesville, Virginia, just as the sun started filtering through the curtains. For a moment, I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of traffic on the road outside. It was the kind of morning that should have felt joyful. My younger brother was getting married. Families were gathering. Photographs would be taken. Champagne glasses raised. But the truth was, my stomach carried a small knot of tension that hadn't been there when I went to sleep the night before. I swung my legs out of bed and walked to the window. The sky was clear bright blue over the rolling hills and vineyards outside town. Virginia wine country had become a popular place for weddings over the past decade. Daniel's fiancée, Emily, came from a family that appreciated that kind of elegance. The venue was a vineyard estate just outside the city. White tents. Stone terraces. Rows of grapevines stretching out across golden fields. Very beautiful. Very refined. And apparently not the kind of place where a Marine uniform belonged. I showered, shaved carefully around the edges of my short gray hair, and brewed a cup of coffee using the tiny hotel machine. Then I opened the closet. My Marine Corps dress blues hung inside the garment bag exactly the way I had packed them. Pressed. Perfect. Quietly waiting. I stood there for a long moment. You have to understand something about a Marine's dress uniform. It isn't just clothing. It represents years. Sacrifice. Responsibility. Every ribbon on that chest tells a story. Some of them good. Some of them hard. And every Marine who wears it understands that the uniform never belongs entirely to them. It belongs to the Corps. and to the Marines who served before them. I unzipped the garment bag slowly. The deep blue fabric caught the morning light, red piping along the sleeves, rows of ribbons, polished metals, and on the shoulders, 2 silver stars. I ran a hand across the coat. Then I took a slow breath. "Well, General," I said quietly to myself, "let's go to a wedding." The vineyard was about 20 minutes from the hotel. As I drove through the winding roads outside Charlottesville, the scenery was almost painfully peaceful. Autumn was beginning to touch the trees. Leaves showed hints of orange and red along the hills. Farmhouses dotted the countryside. It reminded me a little of Ohio, a little of home. When I pulled into the gravel parking lot, I could already see guests arriving. Luxury cars? Rental sedans. People dressed in suits and pastel dresses walking toward the venue. I parked near the back. For a moment, I simply sat there. Not nervous, just aware. I stepped out of the car and adjusted my coat. The dress blues always fit like armor. Tailored. Structured. Unmistakable. I placed my officer cap under my arm and walked toward the entrance. The reception hall was already filling. A long wooden building overlooking the vineyard fields. White flowers decorated the tables. Soft music floated through the air from a small string quartet near the front. About 120 guests, just like the invitation list said. Family members. Friends. Emily's relatives from New York. Business associates. A few curious glances followed me as I walked inside. At first it was subtle. A whisper here. A pause in conversation there. Then more heads turned. Military uniforms tend to do that. Especially a Marine dress blue uniform. And especially one with 2 stars. By the time I reached the center of the room, nearly everyone had noticed. The conversations faded. The whispers grew louder. I heard someone say quietly, "Is she a general?" Another voice replied, "She must be military." Across the room I saw my mother. She was standing near one of the tables speaking with Emily's parents. When she noticed me, her face froze. Not anger. Not exactly. Something closer to panic. She hurried toward me. "Margaret," she said under her breath, "you wore it." I gave a small smile. "Yes, Mom." Her eyes flicked around the room nervously. "Well, people are looking." I glanced around. "They usually do." She sighed, lowering her voice. "Daniel won't like this." "I didn't come for Daniel," I said gently. "I came for family." That seemed to land somewhere inside her. She didn't argue further. But she looked worried. Then I saw Daniel. My younger brother stood near the bar speaking with a few groomsmen. When his eyes landed on me, his expression changed immediately. Surprise. Then irritation. Then something else. Embarrassment. He walked over quickly. "Maggie," he said. His voice was tight. "You wore the uniform." "Yes." "I thought we talked about this." "No," I replied calmly. "Mom talked about it." His jaw tightened. "This is supposed to be Emily's day." "And it will be." "You're drawing attention." I looked around the room. Guests were still whispering. Watching. Curious. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I'm just standing here." He opened his mouth to respond. And that's when something unexpected happened. At a table near the far wall, one man suddenly pushed his chair back. He stood up quickly. He was wearing a dark suit. But I recognized him instantly. Staff Sergeant Ramirez. Before Daniel or I could say anything, another man stood. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, 20 Marines scattered around the room rose to their feet. Some were guests. Some were family members of Emily's side. Some were simply veterans attending the wedding. But every single one of them recognized the uniform. Recognized the rank. Chairs scraped loudly against the wooden floor. The room fell silent. Then a voice rang out strong and clear. "General on deck." 20 Marines snapped to attention. Their hands rose in perfect unison. Saluting. The entire wedding hall froze. Conversation stopped. Music stopped. Even the string quartet went quiet. 120 guests turned to stare at me. Daniel's face went pale. My mother stood motionless. And somewhere behind us, I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. My father had just dropped his wine glass. And suddenly, My family was seeing me for the first time. For a few seconds, no one in the room moved. 20 Marines stood at attention, arms raised in salute. The vineyard hall had gone completely silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause against the tall windows that overlooked the rows of grapevines. I stood there in the center of the room, officer cap tucked under my arm. For a Marine, moments like that carry a certain weight. Not pride exactly. Responsibility. The salute wasn't for me personally. It was for the rank. For the uniform. For every Marine who had worn it before. Still, I could feel 120 pairs of eyes fixed on me. Staff Sergeant Ramirez was the one who had called the room to attention. He stood straight as a rifle rod, eyes forward, hand sharp at the edge of his brow. I recognized several others, too. A gunnery sergeant from Camp Lejeune. 2 captains I had mentored years earlier. A retired master sergeant with silver hair who had once commanded a logistics unit in Afghanistan. I had no idea they would be here. But Marines have a way of appearing where you least expect them. I shifted my weight slightly and returned the salute. "Carry on," I said calmly. 20 hands lowered at once. The Marines relaxed and slowly sat back down. The moment had lasted maybe 10 seconds. But the room felt completely different now. Guests were whispering openly. A few older men, veterans by the look of them, nodded respectfully toward me. Across the room, my brother Daniel looked stunned. His face had gone pale, just like I remembered from childhood when he used to get caught doing something he shouldn't. My mother stood beside him, frozen in place. And my father was staring at me like he had never seen me before. A waiter rushed over to clean the broken wine glass near his feet. I adjusted my coat and calmly walked to an empty seat near the edge of the hall. The best revenge is often quiet. And patience had been part of my training for 3 decades. The ceremony began about 20 minutes later. Daniel and Emily exchanged vows beneath a small wooden arch outside the hall. The vineyard hills rolled behind them, glowing in the late afternoon sun. It was a beautiful wedding. Emily looked radiant. Daniel looked nervous. I sat quietly in the back row beside 2 Marines who had attended the earlier salute. One of them leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "Ma'am, didn't expect to see you here." I smiled faintly. "Neither did I, Captain." He chuckled softly. "I guess Marines are everywhere." That was true. No matter where you go in America, chances are there's a veteran somewhere nearby. Sometimes they recognize each other without even speaking. A posture. A haircut. A way of carrying themselves. The ceremony ended with applause. Guests returned inside for the reception. Music started again. Wine was poured. Conversation slowly resumed. But the tone had changed. People kept glancing toward me. Not the curious glances from earlier. Something different. Respect. Curiosity. Maybe even a little awe. A gray-haired man approached my table first. He wore a simple suit and walked with the careful stiffness of someone who had lived with old injuries for a long time. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely. "Yes, sir." He nodded toward my uniform. "Vietnam," he said quietly. "1st Cavalry Division." I stood up immediately and shook his hand. "Thank you for your service." He smiled. "Looks like you did all right yourself." We spoke for a few minutes. Then another guest approached. And another. Some were veterans. Some were simply curious. One elderly woman told me her grandson had just joined the Marines. A younger man asked what it was like to command troops overseas. The conversations came one after another. Nothing dramatic. Just Americans talking. But across the room I noticed something interesting. My brother was watching. Every time someone approached my table, his eyes followed them. At first he looked irritated, then confused, then thoughtful. My mother sat beside him, whispering something now and then. My father remained quiet. Occasionally he looked at me, then away again, as if he were trying to piece together a story he had never heard before. Later in the evening, the band started playing. Couples moved to the dance floor. Laughter filled the hall again. The tension had softened. I stepped outside onto the terrace for a breath of fresh air. The evening air was cool. Rows of grapevines stretched into the fading sunlight. And for a moment I simply stood there enjoying the quiet. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. My father was standing in the doorway. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally he walked toward me. "I didn't know," he said. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Know what I asked? That you were a general. I nodded slightly. I sent you letters. He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I guess I didn't pay attention. We stood there looking out at the vineyard. I always thought the military took my daughter away, he said after a moment. I didn't respond right away. Then I said quietly, it didn't take me away. It made me who I am. He looked at the medals on my chest. The ribbons. The stars. Then he nodded slowly. I see that now. Inside the hall, laughter drifted through the open doors. Music played. Life continued. But something between my father and me had shifted, and the night was far from over. The music inside the hall drifted out onto the terrace, soft and steady. A slow jazz tune. The kind of music people our age remember from another time before smartphones, before everything felt so rushed. My father stood beside me with his hands resting on the wooden railing that overlooked the vineyard. For a while, neither of us said anything. That had always been our way. When I was a child, my father wasn't a man who talked much. He worked long hours at the hardware store, came home tired, ate dinner, and watched the evening news. He showed love through steady things, fixing a broken bike, helping with homework, making sure the house stayed warm in winter. But words were never his strong suit. Finally, he cleared his throat. So, how long have you been a general? I smiled faintly. About 4 years. He let out a low whistle. 4 years? The way he said it told me something important. This wasn't just new information to him. It was something he had completely missed. I guess you've been busy, he added quietly. You could say that. He nodded. Inside the hall, the band shifted into a livelier tune, and the sound of laughter rose with it. My father stared out across the darkening vineyard. You know, he said slowly when you first joined the Marines, I didn't understand it. I leaned against the railing beside him. Most people didn't back then. He shook his head. It wasn't that I didn't think you were capable. He paused. I just thought it was dangerous. That's fair. And I figured you'd do it for a few years, then come back home. I smiled a little. That wasn't the plan. No, he admitted. I can see that now. We stood there another minute. Then he said something that surprised me. I'm proud of you. 3 simple words. But they carried the weight of 32 years. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I just nodded. For people our generation, sometimes that's enough. Eventually, we went back inside. The reception had reached that comfortable stage where people were relaxed and enjoying themselves. Dinner plates had been cleared. Wine glasses were refilled. Guests were laughing freely. And something interesting had happened while I was outside. The atmosphere around me had completely changed. Earlier in the evening, people had whispered about the uniform. Now they approached openly. A middle-aged couple stopped me near the buffet table. My son's stationed at Camp Pendleton, the man said proudly. Another guest introduced himself as a retired Air Force pilot. One older woman squeezed my hand and said, my husband served in Korea. He would have loved meeting you. Each conversation was polite, respectful. American life at its best. Across the room I saw Daniel watching again. But his expression had changed. Earlier there had been embarrassment. Now there was something closer to confusion. Eventually he walked over. He stood there for a moment before speaking. Maggie. Daniel. He looked at my uniform, then at the Marines seated nearby, then back at me. You never told me you were this high up. I tried, I said gently. You sent letters. Yes. He rubbed his forehead. I guess I didn't read them very carefully. That happens. For a moment he looked like the younger brother I remembered, the kid who used to follow me around the backyard when we were small. Then he sighed. You kind of stole the spotlight tonight. I shook my head slightly. No, Danielle. I just walked into the room. He thought about that. And to his credit, he nodded slowly. Fair point. Emily joined us a moment later. She had overheard part of the conversation. Margaret, she said warmly, I just want to say, your uniform is beautiful. Thank you. My grandfather served in World War II, she continued. He would have loved seeing that tonight. Her sincerity was obvious, and I realized something important in that moment. The embarrassment my brother feared hadn't come from strangers. It had come from misunderstanding. People respect service when they recognize it. Sometimes they just need the chance to see it. Later in the evening, the band announced the final dances. Couples filled the floor again. My mother eventually came over and sat beside me. She studied my uniform carefully. "You look very distinguished," she said quietly. "Thank you, Mom." She glanced across the room where the Marines sat laughing together. I didn't realize so many service members would be here. Marines tend to show up where you least expect them. She chuckled softly. Then she said something that revealed a lot. "I suppose we never asked enough questions about your life." "No," I agreed gently, "you didn't." She looked down at the tablecloth. "But we should have." I placed my hand over hers. "It's never too late." The night ended the way good American weddings often do. Music. Laughter. People hugging goodbye. No dramatic confrontations. No shouting. Just quiet realizations spreading slowly through a family that had spent years misunderstanding one of its own. And in the end, that was enough. Because the real revenge wasn't humiliation. It was understanding. And sometimes, understanding takes time. By the time the reception began winding down, the vineyard had settled into that peaceful kind of evening you only really notice once you've lived long enough to appreciate it. The sky over the hills had turned deep purple. Small lights strung across the terrace glowed warmly above the guests who lingered outside with their final glasses of wine. Inside, the band had packed up their instruments. A few couples were still talking near the dance floor, but most people had begun gathering their coats. Weddings like life eventually quiet down. I stood near the edge of the terrace again, looking out across the dark rows of grapevines stretching into the distance. The air smelled faintly of earth and late autumn leaves. It reminded me of evenings back in Ohio when I was young. Those quiet Midwestern nights when the world felt simple. Behind me, the door opened softly. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Footsteps approached slowly. My father stepped beside me again. For a few seconds, we just stood there. Then he spoke. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about something tonight." I glanced over. "About what?" "About all the years you were gone." The word "gone" caught my attention. "I wasn't gone," I said gently. "I was working." He nodded. "I see that now." He leaned his elbows on the railing, staring out at the hills. "I used to tell people my daughter was in the Marines," he said. "That sounds like pride." "It wasn't always." I waited. "When you left home," he continued, "I thought you were running away." "From what?" "From the life we had here. The small town. The hardware store. The quiet, predictable life he had spent decades building. I understood that now in a way I hadn't when I was 20. "I wasn't running away," I said. "I was running toward something." He let that sit for a moment. "You always were stubborn," he said. "That helped." He chuckled quietly. Then his voice turned more serious. "Tonight, when those Marines stood up..." He stopped speaking. "What about it?" I asked. I realized something. "What's that?" "I never bothered to understand what you actually did." That admission hung in the air between us. "You were just... my daughter in the military." He shook his head slowly. "But to them..." He nodded back toward the hall where several Marines were still talking together near the exit. "You're their leader." I nodded. "That's the job." He took a long breath. I should have paid more attention. Then he turned toward me fully. The porch light above us reflected in his eyes. "Margaret," he said, "I owe you an apology." I didn't interrupt. "I spent years thinking the Marines took you away from our family." He paused. "But tonight I realized something." "What's that?" "They didn't take you. They trusted you." That was the first time he had ever said something like that. And coming from a man of his generation, a man who had grown up in the 1940s, who believed in quiet work and modest lives, it meant more than I expected. "You raised me to work hard," I said. "You taught me that." He shook his head slightly. "I taught you to run a hardware store. You taught me responsibility." That seemed to land somewhere inside him. Then he said something else. "Your mother was worried tonight." I noticed. She thought people would stare. They did. But not the way she expected. No, I agreed. We both smiled at that. The truth is, the evening had changed more than just a few perceptions. It had shifted something in my family. Not dramatically. Not like in the movies. Real life rarely works that way. But something small had begun to grow. Respect. understanding, maybe even pride. After a moment, my father reached out and gently tapped the 2 stars on my shoulder. These mean something, don't they? Yes. Hard to get. Very. He nodded slowly. Well, I guess our little town produced a general. I laughed softly. Looks that way. Inside the hall, Daniel's voice suddenly carried through the open door. Maggie. I turned. He was standing near the entrance, jacket off, tie loosened, looking far more relaxed than he had earlier. What's up? I called. He walked over with Emily beside him. Emily and I were thinking, he said, before everyone leaves, maybe you could take a picture with us. A picture? With the uniform, Emily added. You look amazing. Daniel nodded. And honestly, it would make a pretty great wedding photo. I studied him for a second. Earlier that evening, he had worried the uniform would embarrass the family. Now he wanted it in the wedding album. People grow. Sometimes they just need a little time. All right, I said. We stepped inside, where the photographer quickly gathered us near the big front windows overlooking the vineyard. Daniel stood on one side, Emily on the other. My parents joined us. The photographer adjusted the camera. All right, everyone, she said, big smiles. As the flash went off, my father quietly leaned closer and whispered something I'll never forget. Your mother's going to hang this one in the living room. For the first time in 32 years. That felt like coming home. It has been 8 years since that wedding in Charlottesville. Time moves differently once you pass 60. The years no longer feel like long stretches ahead of you. They begin to feel more like pages already written in a book you've lived through. These days, my mornings are quieter. I retired from the Marine Corps the year after Daniel's wedding. 33 years of service was enough for any Marine, and I knew it was time to pass responsibility to the next generation. My home is still in Jacksonville, North Carolina, not far from Camp Lejeune. Old habits die hard. I like hearing the distant sound of helicopters some mornings. It reminds me that the Corps keeps moving forward even when we step away. My house is small and simple. A front porch with 2 rocking chairs, a small American flag by the steps, and a garden I finally have time to tend. Tomatoes in the summer. Collard greens in the fall. Things I never had time for when my life was measured in deployments and operations orders. But retirement didn't mean disappearing. Far from it. A few months after I left active duty, a young Marine lieutenant invited me to speak at a leadership seminar at Camp Lejeune. I remember standing in front of that room full of young officers, most of them barely 30 years old, looking out at faces full of the same determination I once carried. They asked about strategy, about combat leadership, about promotions. But eventually one young lieutenant raised his hand and asked a different question. Ma'am, he said, how do you deal with people who don't understand your service? The room went quiet, and I thought about that vineyard wedding, about my mother's worried voice on the phone, about Daniel's embarrassed expression when I walked into the room, about 20 Marines rising to their feet. I gave the lieutenant a simple answer. You live your life with honor, I said, and eventually people see it. Not everyone will understand your path right away, but integrity has a way of revealing itself over time. That lesson became part of my life after retirement. I began mentoring young Marines, speaking at veteran events, visiting high schools where students were considering military service. Sometimes I meet young women who remind me of the girl I once was, the one standing in a garage in Ohio with grease on her hands and big dreams nobody quite understood. When they ask if the road is difficult, I always tell them the truth. Yes. But the hard roads are often the ones worth traveling. My family changed too. Not overnight. Real change rarely happens that way. But slowly. Steadily. My father started asking more questions about my career. The kind of questions he probably should have asked years earlier. What was your hardest deployment? How many Marines did you command? What does a general actually do every day? He listens carefully now. Sometimes he even writes things down in a little notebook he keeps by his chair. My mother, meanwhile, discovered something new about her daughter. Bragging. She does it constantly. At church. At the grocery store. At the doctor's office. Did you know my daughter was a Marine general? She tells anyone willing to listen. The first time she said it in front of me, I nearly choked on my coffee. Daniel laughs about it now. And Daniel himself changed more than anyone. A year after the wedding, he began volunteering with a local veterans support organization in Ohio, helping older veterans with home repairs, fixing roofs, building wheelchair ramps, the same kind of work he does every day in his hardware store. Turns out the golden boy of the family had a pretty big heart all along. Emily says that wedding changed the way he thinks about service. Maybe it did. Sometimes one moment is enough to shift a person's perspective. These days when I visit Ohio, my parents' living room has a new addition on the wall. A framed photograph, taken by a wedding photographer in Virginia. Daniel and Emily stand in the center smiling. My mother and father beside them. And there I am too, standing tall in my marine dress blue uniform. 2 stars on my shoulders. The vineyard hills behind us glowing in the evening light. That photo hangs right above the fireplace. My father told me recently it's the first thing visitors notice when they walk into the house. And every time someone asks about it, my mother proudly says the same words. That's our daughter. For a long time I thought respect had to be demanded. Earned through achievements, through rank, through recognition. But age teaches you something different. The greatest victories in life aren't loud ones. They're quiet. They're the slow moments when understanding replaces judgment. When families finally see each other clearly. That wedding day didn't humiliate anyone. It simply revealed the truth. Service is never embarrassing. It's honorable. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't revenge at all. It's patience. It's dignity. It's living a life so full of integrity that even the people who doubted you eventually say, "We're proud of you." If this story reminded you of someone who served, or someone in your own family who walked a path others didn't understand, take a moment today to tell them you're proud of them. Those words matter more than you might think. And if stories like this mean something to you, stories about service, family, and the long road toward understanding, I hope you'll stay a while, share the story with someone who might appreciate it, and join me again for the next one. Because every life holds a story worth telling. And sometimes, the quietest victories are the ones that last the longest.